The observability provider is giving you the option to bring what we call AWS Lambda partner for observability. And within just a few lines, you should be able to switch, for instance, from CloudWatch metrics to Datadog or New Relic, and the list goes on. This would work already for customers having a fat function or a monolithic function, if you'd like, which I love, but no, huge debate on that one.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless, a podcast where I speak with real-world practitioners and get their stories from the trenches. Today, I welcome back Heitor, who's been a really good friend of mine and a previous speaker on the show. Hey, man.
Thanks for having me again. Hey, Jan, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm good. And it's been a while since we actually seen each other in person. I saw you announce recently that the Lambda, the Powertools has now got a whole team behind it. So that seems to be quite a big milestone for what you've been working on. So I thought it's a good time to bring you back on the show and tell us what's been happening and what this means. But I guess before we get into that, can you just maybe introduce yourself in case some of the audience haven't heard about you and the great work that you've been doing?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Heitor. I'm a principal architect at a new team called Powertools for AWS. I've been here for 10 years now, as of actually next week at the time of recording. And I've been doing tons of work in at least the public face of it on the well-architected framework. I launched the well-architected for serverless back in 2017, 18, 19, 20 in the console as well. And I was also lucky to be the first serverless specialist outside US as well. So there's a tons of pieces to learn from and working with you, Jan, since the very, very early days of serverless. And I've also created this toolkit called Powertools, and then eventually created a whole community with everyone, because all these things takes a village. Not a single person would do it itself. And lately, for the last almost 4 years, I would say, I've been very focused on learning how to work in public, in open source, and developer experience from the tooling side of things. I've moved from helping customers modernize their applications to microservices, serverless distributed systems, to providing guidance through well-architected at scale, to now, okay, let me give you a tool that can actually abstract these things so you don't even have to feel you're following a strict set of guidelines. It's just good developer experience, not only for developers, but helps everyone get to a good posture. That's me.
Yeah, I remember we first met when you were a TAM, or technical account manager for Just Eat. That was a lifetime ago. And since then, I've had so many different jobs, and you have as well. Feels like you've had your finger on lots of different pies within AWS, and I really like what you've been doing with the Powertools, because that's one of the things that we did back at the Yabbo, when I was at Yabbo, and then at the Zone, because you just see the same problem come up time and time again, and people trying to find the same, reaching for the same questions and then doing the same thing over and over. So we had a similar model for having this toolkit that kind of just does most of the things for you. And what you've done with the Powertools has taken it a lot further. Now you've got different language supports, have got a consistent set of tenets that different language version of the Powertool all can support and implement. And you've got things like idempotency and a bunch of other things like that, which are a lot more than just about making it easier to use X-ray or logging, but actually goes into architectural and application patterns that are really important when it comes to doing real-time event processing and things like that. So I've been really impressed with what you've done, both in terms of the tool itself, but also in terms of the sort of building in public and the communication and taking feedbacks and improving things. And that has been really, really impressive work. And big thank you for all the things that you've sort of contributed towards the community. And I certainly have started using it myself as well. And I know from previous open source experience how difficult it is to maintain something for a really long period of time and trying to support things on an ongoing basis. And I hope having a team now behind the Powertools means that that's no longer going to be a burden just on yourself, but you have a team to support you and to take things forward, not just for one language, but for multiple languages as well. So can you maybe talk us through what does this new team means for AWS, but also for us as customers?
Yeah, I think a bit of background on Powertools. So Powertools for the last close to 4 years have been largely a side job from all of us, myself included. So you used to have the work with customers and everything in between, and then on the weekends or after working hours, we would do the Powertools work with community and such. And a great part of the success of Powertools was largely through the community and all these volunteers internally and externally. We got so many people working on it. And what we ended up finding it was that it was difficult to find people who would contribute something and maintain something, as you pointed out, for long periods of time. I've noticed after we tried to train people and mentoring people for all these years, and myself included, to learn all these things in open source and working in public, is it's easy to find people who can build new features and new code, but it's very difficult to find people who can think through. It's not only building new code, but also how you're going to refactor these things, allow people to extend this and make it easier not only for the developer that knows a language relatively well, but what about someone coming from ops, SRE, DevOps, and platform engineering? What about someone who's a data scientist, a data engineer, coming to use this for the first time? So that's kind of what it was hard to do this. So eventually we managed to get a few people that stuck with us. And if you've been listening to this, you know who you are. So thank you. Not only community, but also internally, because there's too many people to call out their names. And the team was a long 3.5 years journey to collect enough data from customers that ended up using Lambda Layers as an installation method, which we don't want to be intrusive and collect you or impact your request flow and latency. So those customers, we managed to get enough data to justify. We've been doing this type of work that is not a product, but is a higher level abstraction to make it easier to use multiple AWS services at once. It's covering from the very basic, like logging something, to things like you mentioned. I want to do batch processing and feature flags, idempotency, which will touch at the moment 16 AWS services at the same time, which is not common. And the team was formed on taking the most prolific maintainers that we had with the headcounts we were allocated, at least for now. There's hopefully more in the future. And we managed to staff the most popular languages now. So those, myself included, we're not only having to juggle between our day-to-day and having to do Powertools on the side. So now we have things like, what does it mean to our customers? Now it means we can have on-calls. Now it means that we can have public dashboards, which I can show you in a minute. It means that we can start having a roadmap that we can prioritize 1 or 2 big features, which we're announcing actually tomorrow at the time of recording as well. Actually today, not tomorrow. Tomorrow is Saturday. And
so this is recorded on the Friday, the 18th of August. So I guess by the time you are watching this or listening to this on YouTube or Spotify, it's already out. So go and check it out.
Yeah, I will definitely touch on that one, what it actually means. And it also means that we can look beyond some of the pieces we wanted to do. As you can imagine, without having people full-time, it becomes a bit risky to make big bets. One of the big bets, for instance, was we started in Lambda because we wanted to keep the scope small and to allow us to have a day job and then do this on the side while keeping the quality and such. Now that we have a team, as we get additional headcounts in the future, then we can look into okay, there's a bunch of features already in Powertools that people are already using outside Lambda, in Fargate, in VMware, in SageMaker, Glue, and such, which we don't advertise in the documentation at the moment, but people are using it. And we could now look into how do we revamp some of these features or even a different package so people can start using the Powertools on EC2 and Fargate and on-premises with the promise that we're going to actually support you along the ways and we're going to make optimizations for this type of runtimes as well. So that's in a nutshell what it is. It means people now full-time, people now on call to triage those things on time and to make sure we have a release cadence every 2 weeks or so.
Okay, that sounds amazing. And that's one of the things that oftentimes turns people away from open source solutions, just because you can never be sure that whatever solution you're using is going to be around, is going to be actively supported and worked on. Even some of the most prolific or biggest companies have abandoned their open source projects in the past. There was question marks about the future of Jest until recently, because there's been almost no update for I think a few years, and so people started to migrate to Vitest. And there's lots of examples like that, which you kind of come to accept with open source. It's lots of people that are working at big companies but doing things on the side, but having a full-time team behind it is certainly makes me feel a lot more comfortable in terms of using this tool and having some confidence that it has a long-term future for the company, but also for me as well. So that's great to hear. You mentioned that there's a roadmap. Is that the roadmap public? Is that something you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me. Oh, I can't seem to share the screen again.
Okay, let me
let me
enable
try again.
that. Can you try again?
Yeah, one sec. Okay, let me know if you can see a Firefox page.
Yep, I can see it. And
Okay.
for the folks who are listening on the Spotify and they can't see the screen, you can go to docs.powertools.aws.dev, and that should have a link for you to then go to the roadmap. I will also put a link in the description below so that you can easily go and find it and read for it yourself.
Yeah, I will walk everyone through in audio as well to make sure everyone gets the same level of experience. So this is now in stage. We're making a release today with one of our biggest features of the year, which I'll walk you through next. And this is the page where you can find not only our roadmap, but also what we call the board of activities. Because everything we do is in public, we keep, you can also see not only what's in the roadmap, but also what we're actually working on right now. What I'm showing on the screen now is a GitHub board of activities that we do. So you can see not only what are the pieces we're working as now and what are the potential estimates for this, but also if you are looking to learn something or contribute or get some sort of a mentorship, we also have those pieces in here as well, the help wanted and such. We also work with contributors, especially those that are more frequent, on mentoring on tech writing and a bunch of other areas, because contributing to open source is not only building code, there's all sorts of contributions. Back to roadmap. The pieces that everyone is so excited about it, and is also the hardest to come to life, is what we call observability providers. When Powertools started, we only created 3 features, which are called tracer, logger, and metrics. Today we have many more features than just observability. And when customers start, we tend to use what Lambda already offers out of the box, so you have a nice experience. It just works. So you have CloudWatch logs, and you can easily bring your own, swap for anything you want. But the metrics and tracer were heavily and tightly coupled with the CloudWatch metrics and also X-Ray for that purpose. So the tightly coupled doesn't mean necessarily it's bad. It just means that you get the best possible experience out of the box. But what we've heard from customers were that they started using X-Ray, or they started using CloudWatch metrics, or they already have a policy of or existing investments in other providers, and they still would like to use those specific features, tracing on the metrics with Powertools, while still having the same kind of a nice experience in Docs, but using the providers of their choice. The observability provider is exactly that, giving you the option to bring what we call AWS Lambda Partner for observability. And within just a few lines, you should be able to switch, for instance, from CloudWatch metrics to Datadog or New Relic, and and the list goes on. We have the list actually right here in the documentation as well. So if there's some issue, if there's any provider that you're not going to see in the coming release, please open up a feature request and we'll be looking into it, which brings a more common request as well, which is OpenTelemetry. It's another one that we're working on, but I guess we touched that when we talk about the feedback loop of making sure that it starts with Powertools, but it makes its way back to the platform, so we don't have to keep maintaining it and have a better discoverability. So that's observability providers. if for people that are able to see the screen, what we're launching today is the first provider of our metrics, which is going to have a dedicated page, and every provider will. And this is Datadog. So we were not going to be maintaining their SDKs and everything else to keep it lean, because also we're not a super big team either. So the idea is to Powertools always build on something that's already stable and functional. So if you install Datadog Lambda extension, for instance, or say Lumigo, and the list goes on, all you're going to have to do is to import Datadog metrics from Powertools, and then the experience is largely the same. So we keep the value add experience of capturing cold start metrics or aggregating or some of the other pieces you would typically need at runtime. But when we flush, that would use their mechanisms, their Lambda extension or logs extraction for it to work. So that's what we're launching it now, and one of the biggest roadmap items for the year. Let me go back to the roadmap.
Okay, that's interesting. So I guess the some of these providers have got their own layers. Does the Lambda Powertools then need to depend on those layers being there, or are they going to be using the more traditional the approach of sending a request to their backend, which is going to have latency implications on your Lambda invocations?
It's the former. We want to avoid, it's also part of our tenets. We want to avoid getting in the way of this particular request latency, which is part of the reason why we don't want, we cannot, that's not we don't want, we cannot support OpenTelemetry in this first launch, because it adds some additional latencies we can't control yet at the moment. So what in this link for Lambda observability providers that are partners with us, almost all of them, if not everyone, if I'm not mistaken, they have a mechanism through Lambda extension, so it doesn't impact. So the SDK, we essentially just put directly into the Lambda, the agent that's running as an external process as a Lambda extension, and then that extension will be sending to their backend. So if you take the example of Datadog that we're just launching it, the first integration is when you initialize a Datadog metrics and you add the metrics and you flush, that will be using Datadog SDK to speak to the Lambda extension running that's Datadog. The boundaries that we're setting ourselves, and it's something we take a very strong stance in Powertools, is we don't want to touch infrastructure, at least for now, for the coming year or so. We don't want to get in the business of building our own Lambda extension and handling infrastructure deployments and such. So customers use whatever they prefer, CDK, SAM, and whatnot. They would have to bring their observability provider, in this case, Datadog. Every provider has their best installation mechanism, and we will gate the providers by making sure that they are Lambda certified providers, which means they are following some of those good practices for latencies and whatnot, and to make sure that they have a stable SDK that we can rely on. We do the interface implementation and add this value add features, so the switching becomes easy, and the altering experience and documentation we do ourselves.
Okay, gotcha. So the customer is responsible for configuring the infrastructure to include the provider's Lambda layer, which the provider is responsible for making sure they're implementing it with extensions and the telemetry API, so that there's no impact on the customer's Lambda execution time. And so that's the gate for the provider to become for a certified observability partner as far as Lambda Powertools is concerned. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Thanks for summarizing it.
Okay, cool. That's actually really interesting, and I'm sure there's a lot of other providers, including Lumigo, who's be interested in being partnered with this. So I'm sure you're going to get a few emails after this podcast goes live.
Yeah, looking forward. Yeah, please. All right, so that was observability provider. That's another one, which I think is the second hardest technically wise. We got a POC, which you can click on the links to see it. This is an issue that generally came from data engineers and data scientists. So Powertools is not only used by developers only. We have a wide array of personas actually using it. The most prolific ones are data engineers, data scientists, developers, anyone in the ops group, SRE, platform engineers, and so forth. And also people in AppSec are using Powertools quite a lot. And one of the challenges these groups, these people, these most prolific personas have is sometimes you have a blob of data that's coming in and there's PII data in there, and they want to mask that data either permanently or they want to encrypt parts of the data where one component of your application, think of it as an encryption proxy. One Lambda function encrypts those parts and another one with authorization to decrypt that sort of data. So the idea is just similar to the observability providers and almost everything in Powertools. You can swap these batteries. The default would use AWS encryption SDK, and you can swap for any other provider. Like in Python, is very common to use. It's dangerous for that sort of operation. And what we would do is to give you, as usual in Powertools user experience, 1 or 2 lines where they can just say, encrypt, here's my data, and here are the fields. And then we do all the optimizations to make it work fast enough in Lambda.
Okay, that's really cool. That's something that I haven't seen many other providers do. I think a lot of them, they kind of just send everything they collect. It's one of the things that I think Lumigo actually does, that they scrub data that are matched by some regex, if it's like API keys and the secrets and things like that, so that they scrub it. So this is now a way for you to kind of do it yourself for your own data, even if you're just going into CloudWatch or things like that.
Yeah, exactly. The feedback we got from this one was CloudWatch Logs, for instance, has even SNS got an amazing integration to automatically scrub that sort of data and find this, and they all async, so your Lambda doesn't have any latency. But there are many more use cases that we can't cover with just CloudWatch and SNS in that case. So there are, for instance, one of the most common issues that data engineers face is receiving data with so many PII data that they need to store in a data lake or some other places before they go it. So this wouldn't even go to a provider like Lumigo or others. So they have to find a way to actually do it. Oftentimes, what they end up doing is simply calling KMS as a service for key management and encrypting that data. But what they often find is that it becomes too slow because they don't know how to do it properly. There's also some compliance. How do I make sure that my keys are going to be rotated? Or I only encrypt, let's say, the same 100 times with the same key and make sure that this works. So we're abstracting all of that away and making it easier. So for you, it's just going to be a one-line encrypt or mask or decrypt. And if you can choose another provider or bring another provider if you like.
Okay, got it.
Awesome. In general, so we don't spend all the remaining of our time in the roadmap, there's one thing that's very popular, and we're looking into it as well from a different lens. We initially thought it wasn't going to be as popular, but it became like crazy popular. It also came from the community of Powertools as well. We only revamped afterwards. It's called Event Handler. The idea of Event Handler is you have a Lambda function that's being invoked by API gateway in its many forms, REST or HTTP API, or ALB, the load balancer, or Lambda function URL, and more recently, VPC lattice. They have similar payloads, but they have differences that alone, they would be difficult to implement if you were to do it by yourself. So it's kind of a lightweight framework that all it does is basically routing this event that's coming in to a function that you defined, let's say as a view in the old MVCs model. The idea is one of the Powertools tenets is about being progressive. We know that many customers, when they start with using Lambda functions, they already have their framework of choice, and they already have built this institutional knowledge on how to define a route and how to do certain things within a REST API. And the event handler is basically built for that purpose. So to give you that lightweight experience optimized for cold start and not give you the full bloated framework that you may not need all these batteries in there, and try to rely on features that API gateway provides or ALB provides as well, and focus more on this kind of a runtime routing capability. This roadmap item is the next evolution of that. As people are building more of these REST APIs and these GraphQL APIs with Powertools, a common question now is about adding middleware support. It's something we wanted to do, but we wanted to wait for more feedback. Now that customers are more mature, it's something we'll be adding in the next few weeks. Thanks to Michael from Accenture and also AWS Serverless Hero, who's been helping a lot. And the hardest one, which makes sense in a web server, but it doesn't make much sense in a Lambda. When these folks are building these APIs, they want the ability to have a Swagger UI so they can see their API endpoints documented. It works great if you have a single function, a single fat function that everything just works because you just have one single deployment unit and then it's easy to expose that. But it becomes more difficult when you have tiny functions handling one route or parts of this route. So what we're trying to do now with this feature, and with Ruben is working on it, is first make sure that with one switch you can say generate open API spec, and in this case you have a new, and you can simply get a open API and then a new endpoint, say Swagger if you like. We're still debating on that, and then you can have all the rights in there. This would work already for customers having a fat function or a monolithic function, if you'd like, which I love, but not here to debate on that one. And the other phase of this is to have a method in this event handler that would create fragments of this open API schema that you could aggregate later. You can publish on S3 if you'd like, or you can have a CLI that would scan your code and then create a single gigantic open API schema of everything up to date. The idea for this is to always make sure that maybe you can start with a fat function and then eventually break down, or the opposite as well. Maybe you start with a very single purpose function and eventually merge some of those functions you have and not lose the ability to have a up-to-date schema with data validation and whatnot. Long explanation, but that's basically it.
That's actually you actually bring up a really interesting question, because and there's also something that's been pretty hotly debated in terms of whether you should use a fat function and do your own routing, or do you have one function per endpoint method, which is the kind of the sort of micro, well, or more, what do you call it, the single responsibility, single purpose functions approach. And I'm definitely in the second camp, because it gives you better, I guess, security posture, be able to have a tailored IAM roles for each function. And also, if you've got a mix of different workloads and dependencies, it also helps you reduce the cold start overhead for each function. If, say, you're doing both server-side rendering and some REST API stuff in the same API, you don't have to load the React dependency for the functions and endpoints that are just returning some data from DynamoDB in REST. But I understand there's a lot of customers who want to migrate from existing application that's just one big Express.js app to Lambda to get some of the benefits. You don't want to force them to have to restructure and rewrite the entire application. So having that fat function being able to run Express.js inside Lambda is useful. But sounds like you actually quite like the idea of having fat functions. Can you maybe talk us through your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. This is like such a common discussion that we documented at least partially, because I don't want Powertools documentation, at least in this form. We have plans for something else, but not now, not ready to share. That if you go to the event handler documentation, there's something called considerations, which is not trying to say one is better than the other, but trying to give you a more honest opinion, I suppose. Like Powertools, we are very opinionated. Otherwise, we'd have too many different ways of configuring something. And we are writing it down on some of the common trade-offs worth knowing when you're choosing a monolithic approach or a microfunction single responsibility. My take on this is it has changed over the years. When I started as a serverless specialist, my goal was, look, this is all about having a single function handling just what it needs to be exactly in the exactly same set of permissions, and you're gold. In theory, that works great. In practice, it starts to become an issue as soon as you have more people working on it, and depending on the language you have, and depending on the build setup you have, framework you have. One of the common challenges for serverless, and one of the reasons I wanted to build Powertools, is that I ended up making a mistake on saying this is the serverless way that you should build applications. And I initially used to think that people building applications for serverless were all developers. And there's a huge bridge that we still have to construct to meet these people where they are with their knowledge. And what you ended up finding with this micro versus monolithic, it's not a good debate in the sense of just showing this is the best way or the other, because people tend to start with one and then eventually gravitate to another one and then eventually have a blend approach. What do I mean by this? I would take a customer that uses Powertools that has a few million functions in multiple so many accounts. And what happens is that the fat function it's a great one to start if you are actually building, like you said, you're migrating for an existing application, you already have all the knowledge, and you migrate and eventually start breaking it away. First, make it work. The other one is eventually they start breaking it, they get into different functions, and you get another problem, which is an operational issue where you have hundreds or thousands of Lambda functions, and some of it has a licensing issue, not from Lambda or from AWS, but you might be using a provider that would charge you per unique Lambda function. For instance, you have something installed. So now what your architecture design that looks fantastic on a slide becomes a bit of a cost issue as well, and you have to rethink that model. That's why saying the serverless way is you have a serverless purpose function, it becomes a bit more problematic, and the context is always required. So this customer, or not only this, but many others, you go from a monolithic function typically in two occasions. The one that I just mentioned, you are migrating from something you already know, or different from Node.js, Python doesn't have this great bundling or the tree shake that you have where you can have different files and eventually just bundle into one. In Python, you would have the concept of the namespaces, and the challenge of the way you build Python applications, it's very different the way you build a Lambda function, because the way the import system works, and it's always messy, especially when you use, let's say, some CLI to build your function, and then you have to have additional customizations in your project setup for your tasks to be able to discover everything, and to work locally, and to work in Lambda. So that little issue that you end up bumping into makes people to know, you know what, I will just have a single function with everything because it makes my development productivity much faster. And then eventually they start breaking into, I'm going to use a layers for shared code. I'm going to be using here or there. So it's a combination of this two.
Okay, so those are some great points, and especially on the one about having to structure a function because of certain providers' pricing structure, kind of force you to do that. I've seen that quite a lot, especially with Datadog, because their pricing for Lambda is by the per function. It's things like $5 per function. So if you got lots of functions, then it's going to get really expensive. And I guess usually it comes down to, okay, either switch providers or you basically do a fat function instead of a single purpose functions. And I guess depending on whether or not the person writing the Lambda function is also the one that's choosing the provider, you may have to just go down the route of having a fat function because you're stuck with Datadog. So what can you do? You don't want to incur a massive bill just because you have just because you decide to have more granular Lambda functions. So that I totally understand. I guess I'm not that familiar with Python, so I guess I'll trust you with what you just said there. But in that case, do you also see people? Because I guess in my interaction with a lot of communities, some of them have pretty strong opinions. I guess myself included, in terms of single purpose functions should be the default. Do you have so if you're starting with a greenfield project, do you have any preference to lean one way or the other nowadays?
Nowadays I changed. So I would always start with a fat function to begin with, mostly because I'm still trying to define the same way that when people start with microservices, oftentimes what they get wrong is because they haven't got the boundaries right. So I would start with the fat function first, just so I'm trying to organize these ideas and what the views are and all the operations, what's shared code, what's actually not really should be a shared code. And then as I progress, I will start to break that down, especially when we're looking at how much of a security privilege that function actually has. So I will start use that as a north, I would say. But I usually start with the fat function and then start breaking as I need. But the reason I say this is a fat function and such is there's a great element on this cognitive load on the people on the team. And as these people change and how much time you have to spend to onboard people with all the toolings and all these separations and such, which can take some time.
Okay, that's really interesting. That's actually quite probably the opposite of my flow. I start with a lot of API design first, and then I have individual functions to do those, and only when I have to, for some reason, then I start to aggregate things together. But my function, they themselves oftentimes have a shared code just in the same in the same project. But I guess on the shared code side of things, another one of my long running disputes or disagreements with the AWS DA team or developer advocate team is the use of Lambda layers as a mechanism to share code, because I actually find if you try to use it, it runs into lots of problems if you try to use it as a replacement for, say, in the JavaScript. Instead of using npm, you will upload your share code to Lambda layers. That just end up being a lot more things you got to do. It's also missing things like semantic versioning. A lot of the built-in tooling for your language doesn't really support it, and many of the framework that you use doesn't also, for example, if you're running a test locally to test your code, well, JS doesn't know about your Lambda layers. So only if you try to invoke it locally with, say, SAM or Server Framework or some tool that supports fetching your Lambda layers before invoking your code locally, then you're kind of also out of luck. And it also just doesn't quite work with static languages like Java and .NET. So there's just so many problems. I just never find it a good way to share code between projects. Do you have sounds like you've got a different experience. I guess with Python, Lambda layer kind of makes a lot more sense than some of the other languages, because with Python, the whole requirement txt is kind of weird coming from other languages runtimes. And the packaging Lambda functions with your dependencies is a challenge. And I do feel with that, Lambda layers kind of solve the problem that probably doesn't exist with the other language environments.
Yeah, well, as usual, I have strong opinions on this. Which is part of the reason why I loved the fat function first, because Lambda layer then becomes a tiny detail about optimizing the build more than anything else. So if we put aside the compiled languages and just focus on, let's say, Python, Node.js, which is the most common ones nowadays, in layers, the way I treat it is twofold. One, you are using a provider, and typically one of their best options is to use a layer because they already have compiled, or maybe because it's a Lambda extension, so there's no way around it. That's an easy one to define. The other one is when to use a Lambda layer in your code for shared coding and whatnot. So in that one, I typically treat Lambda layer just as an build optimization and nothing else. If I looked into my shared folder, for instance, I have a package that I would have to install as if it was a private dependency. And Lambda layers is basically just packaging that and already injecting into my code. So my unit tests, integration tests, functional tests, end-to-end will just work just like anything else. The only difference is I'm making it easier to build once and deploy across hundreds of functions or one function and whatnot.
So let me just make sure I understand that. Does that mean that you still have that shared code, that internal library published into like a package manager for your language, like npm? but you just include that, also include it as you also distribute it as a Lambda layer, so that at deployment time you don't have to ship the npm package, but you just reference the Lambda layer that's been deployed.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I would still treat it as on any normal library, like I would have to have in my private places. But in some cases, I would have to be, especially Python, that you interrupt with so many languages, like with Rust and C and C++ and whatnot. Those builds take a while. Even if we have mechanisms to actually make it easier nowadays, it's often it's easy to get it wrong. Let's put it this way: when you're building for your local machine or Mac or Windows, and then you have to build it for Lambda, which uses Linux in a different architecture and such. So Lambda layer for me in this case becomes I wouldn't necessarily have let's say a shared layer that other teams would actually consume it. I would want every independent team to build their own layer for that particular project, and this would use a particular private package, if you like. Could be npm, could be PyPy, code artifact, and whatnot. So for me, it's just a way to pre-package this thing and then include it, but not the same way we treat an external provider like Datadog and Amigo and Lambda's extensions. If I were to treat it that way, then I get into the issue you're describing, which is something I also bump into this issue all the time because of Powertools. The lack of semantic versioning makes this thing complicated to do at scale, because it now requires you to have a whole CI/CD pipeline for every Lambda layer you have to own inside your company, and have SNS and documentation and everything else, which makes it tricky. If I isolate that within the team, which Lambda layer now, it just becomes a optimization for that one, then I'm no longer fighting Lambda layer has a place in favor of npm pip. That shouldn't be a discussion, in my opinion.
Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. That's actually how I use the Lambda layers as well. Every project, instead of, I guess for me, instead of every project, every team, I will have every project because with the server framework, there's a plugin. It's quite clever that it looks at your package.json to see what version of your dependencies are, and then it compares, and then the first time you deploy a project, it will create a Lambda layer with all of your dependencies, upload it, and create a Lambda layer version 1. But the next time you deploy, if none of your dependencies have changed, it would just reference the same version. So your deployment becomes much smaller and faster, because you don't have to upload like a 50 meg AWS SDK every single time if the version hasn't changed. So I'm using it exactly the same way that you are. I'm not using it as a replacement for npm for all the reasons we talked about, but only use it as a deploy time optimization to make my deployments more efficient, especially when my dependencies haven't changed.
Yeah, it's exactly the same way. One of the reasons I love some CLI for that is I can have a folder called shared, and I can have a requirements.txt, which is already a lock in my case, with all the dependencies that I know. That's a digest, this is the SHA, and it would just work just like any other. And then in my setup of my development environment, I just store those dependencies. I know the version, I know everything, and I have control. It doesn't change. Lucky days, your deployments is just probably 1 second now.
Okay, that's cool. That's great. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I kind of just sort of sidetracked us and
no problem.
Kidnap our conversation to talk about something outside of Lambda Powertools. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Lambda Powertools, you mentioned that other customers been using it in environments outside of Lambda. Is that something that you continue to kind of focus on? And have you learned any lessons in terms of what lessons have you learned from those usage outside of Lambda?
Yeah, we learned quite a lot, which is quite cool. Inside, I wouldn't say it's hidden, it's just there, but we haven't given the proper focus within the Powertools repositories. If you go, especially Python, because it's biggest right now, if you go to discussions, there will be a pin discussion called, is it possible to use Powertools outside Lambda? And then I still need to update my answer. That was 2020, well, that was last year. That I was basically explaining why certain things don't work, but now the observability provider, that's no longer the case for tracer and metrics as well, because this would be out of date. And what we learned was that first, my biggest surprise was if some customers they love using another open source project, which is great in my opinion, called Lambda Web Adapter. So when you bring in Lambda Web Adapter, so it makes Lambda just look like another container, if you like. It changes the execution model of Lambda. So what we are now used to work with the handler always being executed first, and then have this kind of a request and response model in Lambda and completely isolated. That changes a bit in the Lambda Web Adapter. And so one of the lessons we learned, and especially customers also using this in Fargate, which I'll touch in a minute, was that we had to add certain features in Powertools that if I go to, let me go to idempotency because it's one of the popular ones being used outside of Lambda by a great margin now. The default experience for using idempotency, if it's just a very basic usage, imagine you have a Lambda being triggered by CloudWatch or step functions, if you like, event bridge step functions. This will just work with Lambda handler. So what this idempotent does, it makes sure that if there's the exact same payload came in, it will make sure that this will return the same response as before using JSON serialization and whatnot. And then it takes into account the Lambda context if your function is, times out and that sort of thing. So you have protections on those things. But what we learned was customers wanted to use this in non-handler places. So imagine any function, think any synchronous or asynchronous function. And in here, we have a signature that this is where the data is coming in, the configuration, persistency, and whatnot. It's no different than running your code locally or on a container or anything else. It's just a function that has something there's a payload coming in and an output coming out. And we started adding these things now in Powertools. I wouldn't say quietly, some of those things were enhancements, that if you just use this part of idempotency, for instance, then that's it. It works. And we started noticing customers using things like Logger, for instance, which all it does is it keeps things in memory, like the formatting and whatnot, so you can use across your code base. And at the end, it only spits out something to standard output. So it works universally anywhere. And what we found, which was super interesting, and that's how I changed my mind about serverless after all these years, after 7 years even, of working with serverless primarily at AWS, was that I initially was very biased towards the developer trying to use serverless for the first time and have these discussions about from vendor lock-in to cold starts and performance, all these things you and I know for ages. We had this debates for a long time. But different personas, data scientists and data engineers, for instance, especially data scientists, they use Logger the most. They want to use Jupyter Notebook, for instance, and they want to do some experimentation, some models. And when they do that data analysis, Logger actually makes their life easier on logging some additional information and such. And eventually they might want to use metrics in Fargate because it's much easier. Fargate now integrates with CloudWatch EMF, embedded metric format, so it just works. So they start with a Jupyter Notebook or something locally and eventually migrate straight to Fargate, or start with Lambda and then go to Fargate and vice versa. So those things helped us understand that the provider ability is a great one because you can just say, this is the provider for Lambda, the default. But you could also use another provider now and the experience remains the same. And that keeps us honest with the progressive tenant. We don't expect customers to use all features of Powertools at the same time. In fact, most start with either Tracer, Logger, and Metrics, and eventually they start getting upgraded into the real developer boost or development boost, I suppose, in other features.
Okay, that's really interesting. I guess that I'm a developer that's building those features, so this is all kind of new to me in terms of the different use cases for data scientists, for instance, what they will have. So that's quite interesting. But I guess another question in that case is I have about Powertools is that you've been, we talked about the fact that you've been working in public, and that's something that you've learned a lot about in our recording conversation. You also mentioned that some customers now have even seen your success of working in public, and they're pursuing some sort of inner source model where they're creating like internal open source culture to share code, share learnings. And what advice would you have for those customers now that are sort of building up this kind of a internal community of developers with internal libraries and sharing? Any advice that you give to those guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a pull request about this as well, as you can imagine. There's always something power tools. If I go to closed pull request, and if you in Python, and if you search for double underscore str for string, double score again, you'll find a pull request that's called feature event sources add string to data classes. At the end of it, you'll see something that we often have a conversation with platform engineers in very large companies. And one of the things that was very difficult to get it right in Power Tools, and it's still something we learn every day. I don't know all the answers. I'm still learning. There's so much to learn, is how you treat documentation as your product and how you actually have to be very disciplined on what goes into the documentation. One of the common challenges for people doing inner source is that they tend to abstract something like Power Tools, which happens a lot, and they have default settings in there, and they export this as a thing. The two common challenges for inner source is that they accidentally make a mistake in abstracting something that changes more frequently than they can actually add value-add features. As in, if they are abstracting Power Tools, for instance, immediately without any added benefits, it creates a cognitive load issue where they have to go back to this platform engineer team or these people doing inner source to figure out what more can I use, where can I find documentation for these things. So, which eventually leads to my second lesson is building a platform from platform engineer, all these folks who also use Power Tools. And we even have a channel in the Discord called Platform Engineering now that we can discuss these things more freely with everyone. So please join us. Let's continue the conversation. Is no matter how great you are at development, if their documentation isn't up to scratch, not only for the target audience you have, but for the additional personas you may not even are aware that are going to be using your product or a feature or whatnot, then you're going to have an issue with retention. And then eventually you get into this issue where you have shadow IT and platform engineering and a bunch of other folks. So the documentation in this particular pull request was our first attempt at describing our mental model on how we approach phrasing or a sentence, even in our documentation. Because, mind you, in a company nowadays, you're not going to have only British people or US citizens and such. You're going to have people from all over the world, and their interpretation of how you write things and how you read and what keywords, that matters a lot. And this taken here is our explanation about this is what a contributor started with to explain how you handle JSON in a particular way if it fails to be deserialized, and how we started taking global English style into account and taking into our tenants and start asking our questions on what if a data scientist comes in and you talk about JSON deserialization? Do they understand what this is? Can someone from Ops who never probably used this in the first place, they only use Ansible and now they have to use these things. So there's a lot that you have to take into account. Documentation is a whole different skill set altogether that you have to hone and you have to do it every day to get better at it. Your documentation is largely the key for success of this inner source, besides the community building, running surveys, and understand your customer working backwards, which I think most of people at AWS would advocate for that, which is our core. But documentation is the biggest lesson when we speak with this platform engineering folks doing inner sourcing, because relying on an external documentation, oftentimes what happens is people just keep using the basics until they realize there's a whole different universe they haven't explored yet.
Yeah, lots of projects live and die by documentation. Doesn't matter how good your project is. If people don't know how to use it, no one's going to use it. And I really love the point that you touched on about oftentimes platform teams or teams within a large organization would prematurely abstract away things before they even understand what the different use cases they have internally, and that creates bottlenecks and friction. And I think a lot of times that many of these teams, they overestimate their ability to come up with the right abstractions in the first place, especially when you're creating abstractions for other people that's going to be using your library. So you're not even the right persona or the right person to be creating those abstractions. And I've seen those play out in so many different painful ways. So to help other people also prevent themselves or help themselves, I'm going to put a link to the Powertools Discord channel as well. So please go ahead and ask Heitor for advice about platform engineering, and also about documentations and when to create abstractions for Lambda Powertools, so that you don't fall into some of the common traps that we've seen other people fall into. And talking about documentation, another thing that's been kind of on the horizon is the whole generative AI, and there's a lot more tools now available that some of them can even ingest your documentations and generate chatbot, or maybe even write some of your documentations for you. So I imagine that those can be quite helpful going forward. So talking about AI, how does Powertools sort of fit into the picture? Is that something that you guys are thinking about, different AI use cases, or what are you guys thinking about?
Yeah, we definitely are, and it goes back to the community, right? We always try to work backwards, and we're looking for customers wanting to use, especially Python, because it's like king in this land, right? Data scientists, AI, and so forth. And Ruben, who's a maintainer and full-time employee on that sense, he's one of our kind of local experts, I suppose, in the area. And one of the areas we're exploring is to use, it's not in the roadmap yet, it's still early days, because it's still connected to the roadmap item of revamping event handler with OpenAPI schema and whatnot. It's to use the new Bedrock agents, which could call Lambda to enrich the response from the LLM and whatnot. And we could easily, in Powertools, offer an experience where you can say, here's how you can create an agent, and here's how you can optimize the response, enrich the response, and use the plethora of features in Powertools to go even further. The option that we're looking into that was one of the options. Another one that we use, which is not specifically for Bedrock, but is something we use as maintainers that could be useful to people. We had an initial take on using those AI tools for helping us code. It helps to an extent. It's great, and it's being a good productivity. But as a maintainer of a library that has to take into account user experience to extreme and documentation to an extreme, what we've been using it is a tool like Perplexity.ai and similar solutions to say something like, I want to build a new middleware experience for Powertools. Here's our documentation link. Go and learn it. And I want you to go and explore how other languages and the most popular frameworks out there for Java, .NET, JavaScript, and so forth handle this situation. And then we kind of use this as to cut down our research assistancy and then dig deeper into those things. So that ideally in the future, we could even use GenAI in our documentation to say, which persona are you? Are you coming from a data engineer background, data scientist background, and then swap the documentation for that area specifically. With something we already do explicitly, we try to do something that will work for 80% of those personas, but we could go to the extra mile by using something like this in the future.
Okay, looking forward to that. And Bedrock has been quite interesting. I spoke with Randall recently about it, and looking forward to it actually becoming available to everyone to actually try out. The idea of Bedrock agents does sound really promising and really interesting.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, I think we're just over the hours. So yeah, thanks, Heitor, for taking your time today. And it's always a pleasure to have you on the show and to talk to you. You're one of the more sort of thoughtful people in this whole space, and always have some really useful insights to share. Yeah, again, I'm really impressed by the work that you've been doing on the Lambda Powertools. So good luck and good job.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I also would like to thank everyone just before we close that Powertools is so many maintainers and also so many people from the community helping us out. We couldn't make it this far without your support. So this is for everyone. Thank you for having me, and good luck. Have an amazing weekend, Ian.
You too. Take it easy, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.